a conversation on the future of America's healthcare, please welcome Francis Collins, former director of the National Institutes of Health, with The Atlantic's Jeffrey Goldberg.
I feel like I was just here. Thank you all for coming. We're glad to have this opportunity, Dr. Collins. This is a very, very important conversation, and I appreciate you doing this. And I know our audience is very pleased to see you as well. I was hoping, because we have some time to really talk about the issues facing NIH and science and health in this country, maybe we could start with you talking about how your path to the NIH and the many different jobs and many different programs you ran, the research you did at NIH, just to sort of give people the context of your busy and accomplished life. You just left NIH, obviously, after more than 3 decades. Tell us how you got there and what you did when you were there.
I'm glad to do that, and thanks, Jeffrey. It's nice to have a conversation with you. You've been kind of busy lately. I'm glad you could fit this in.
Yeah, I only talk to the experts.
Well, very quickly, because if I told you my whole bio, we would use up our time. I didn't start out in medicine. I actually started out in chemistry, and then discovered that life science was a lot more interesting than I had realized, and went to medical school in North Carolina.
I actually found biology a little messy at first. Is that right?
It still is. But it's messy in a really interesting way that makes you want to sort it out. So it's a wonderful challenge for a scientist to try to figure out, how does this work? And how does it go wrong sometimes? And how can we do something about that if it's causing a disease? So in medical school, I could see that the idea of connecting the study of the human body with the emerging field of genetics was going to be really exciting, although it was pretty nascent at that point, and decided that's what I wanted to do. I got trained as an internal medicine doctor. I did a fellowship in molecular biology. I finally ended up with a real job at age 34 in the University of Michigan, chasing down causes for diseases that we didn't have good answers for, most notably cystic fibrosis. And in a very difficult challenge at that point with the kinds of technologies we had, which were pretty limited, we did succeed in finding the cause of that disease in 1989. And by the way, I have to say, this is a nice example of how that kind of discovery may take a long time to pay off, but now the drug treatment for cystic fibrosis approved in the last couple of years means that most people, 90%, are now planning for retirement instead of early funerals. So, wow.
Wait, just to stay on that point for 1 minute. When was the first notable breakthrough in cystic fibrosis? In 89, or was it even before?
It was really 89, finding that there was this missing 3 letters in a previously unknown gene, 3 letters out of 3 billion that's in the DNA instruction book, but in that vulnerable place, causing this disease for most people who had it, and just completely opening your eyes as to the basic problem, which up until then had just been descriptive. You could say what happened to the lungs and the pancreas and the sweat glands, but you didn't know why, and now you did.
Is that length of time, is that normal in terms of initial discovery or initial insight to approved and effective drug treatment or surgical treatment?
That was sort of the first one where we actually got all the way to that drug treatment from a very early gene discovery. But that's telescoping now, and it needs to. 30 years is too long. Now we've discovered the cause of some 7,000 genetic diseases. And my hope, which we could talk about as one of those big, exciting moments that we face if we have the resources and the momentum, is to figure out a scalable way to approach all of those disorders. So you don't have to do what was done for cystic fibrosis, which was an enormously complex and expensive series of experiments over 3 decades, you actually use this amazing trick of CRISPR, the gene editor, if you know what's misspelled in somebody with the disease, you just go and fix it. And that is something you could do across many different diseases without having to have a special approach to each one.
Right. So continue the march through that.
Yeah, I got distracted.
No, I got distracted.
It was clear to me from that cystic fibrosis effort, which was enormously complicated and expensive and burned out a lot of trainees, that we couldn't do that for all diseases, especially more complicated ones like cancer and heart disease. We had to at least have a reference copy of the human genome. That was the idea of the Human Genome Project. So I was a fan of that. I didn't expect to be asked to lead it, but that happened. The initial leader was none other than James Watson of Watson and Crick, and a rock star who could get people in Congress to meet with him, but also somebody who didn't have much of a governor on what he happened to say. And after he insulted the NIH director a few too many times, he was suddenly gone. And then my phone in Ann Arbor was ringing saying, "Hey, how about you?" And this was not what I thought was my life plan, the idea of giving up a wonderful opportunity to teach medical students, take care of patients, do research, and become a gulp federal employee. But it was the most amazing opportunity I could possibly imagine. At the point, by the way, that most people thought this was a bad idea and thought it was going to fail, including the scientific community that was not at all behind the Genome Project in 1992. But I decided it's worth it. How would I face myself if I turned it down? And then 30 years later, I thought that was the best job you could have ever had. So I took it. And it was a wild ride, Jeffrey, because we had all these people to try to bring together and work towards a common goal who were used to being in charge. This wasn't really the usual pattern for life science, was small labs run by a principal investigator, not really that collaborative. This had to be across multiple countries, multiple labs, and it was. We had to invent new technologies to do what was a very slow, expensive process, faster and better and cheaper. And fortunately, we did.
And then you got the big job, the bigger job.
The bigger job.
Why were you asked? Why did you take it?
You know, I stuck with the genome research even after we had that reference sequence for another 5 years, trying to figure out how to read it, because it's written in this language that's deceptively simple with just 4 letters in its alphabet, but it's really hard to understand. But I got burned out and restless, and I actually left the government for about a year to write a book, to think about what was going to be next, and then got the call to come back to be the director of the whole NIH by President Obama. And it was impossible to say no when you get asked to do something of that sort.
Can I ask you a question? At a job at that size, does the president actually ask you himself, or does somebody reach out? How does it actually work?
The secretary asked.
But says the president wants
the
you?
Secretary with a capital S, not the White House secretary.
His secretary, yes, I get it. They say the president wants you to do this.
Yes.
So you don't really have a choice.
Yes, and he's going to nominate you, and good luck with that. And so back in those days, it was different.
But good luck with that. You had every single senator vote for your confirmation.
I did. Can you imagine that?
Let me pause here in the sequence, just break this question out, because I think this is so it's sort of obvious that no one gets everyone in the Senate to support them anymore. What changed between then and now? If you had gone up, same record, if you had gone to the Senate now for NIH approval and then another administration, let's say, when you look back at that time, what was fundamentally different about the Senate or the nature of politics? Sorry, that's a very large breakout question.
Well, this was 2009. We were showing some signs of divisiveness at that point. We were polarized about certain things, but not the way we are now in 2025. And certainly,
was there a carve-out for science and medicine?
There was kind of a carve-out. I mean, relationships I had during the Genome Project and then subsequently as the NIH director with members of Congress were every bit as intense and cordial and meaningful and substantive with both parties. There was really no distinction because everybody wanted to see progress made in finding answers to cancer and Alzheimer's disease and whatever concern they had about themselves and their family, and everybody has some. So it was at the point where you could walk into those discussions and forget which party you were talking to, and you could have a hearing about medical research, and it would be substantive. It would be questions about, okay, what is the new thing that you've just discovered about this particular disease like ALS, and how is that going to get us to a closer answer? And that was wonderful. It was an intellectually exciting kind of atmosphere, and it was everybody's on board here, that this is one of the most important things the government does, is to support this kind of research.
Okay, so you're the director. You're doing it for a long time. When did you notice that those conversations changed?
I think our more polarized society became more and more clear during the Obama years, and certainly by the time we got to the elections of 2016, it was pretty clear that what used to be arguments about priorities and policies started to get much more personal. And that's when Braver Angels got started, by the way, an organization that I'm part of, trying to figure out how do we get people back together, because we seem to be moving off into our separate, mostly politically driven bubbles.
What do you ascribe the change to?
I think it's a trend that was gradually happening, mostly driven by politics, and mostly driven by kind of a mean-spirited politics that aimed not just to say those people who don't agree with me are misguided, but they're dangerous and maybe they're evil and I don't want to talk to them anymore. And that was gradually happening. And may I say, social media emerging in a big way 15 years ago played into that in a very unfortunate circumstance, because what spreads on social media, as you well know, is not valuable, well-framed facts about how things work. It's stuff that makes you mad and makes you want to do something to hurt those other bad people or say something terrible to them.
Take us through 2021, and talk about one or two of what you think of as the biggest achievements along the way for NIH.
I will be glad to. So, yeah, I served Obama, I served Trump, I served Biden for a year, and then I decided after 12 years it was enough and time for somebody else to step in. And by the way, little plug here, I write about all this in my book, which might be out there at the break, called The Road to Wisdom, so have a look at that. I think what obviously dominated everything in 2020 was COVID. And it landed in a place where we already had a lot of disagreements and divisiveness. But for a couple of months there, it almost felt like here is the common enemy that's going to bring us together. Or remember, March, April, yeah, we were all hunkered down. We were scared to death, but we were cheering for the healthcare providers and trying to do all the right things.
But you're in the meetings every day with Donald Trump. Was that a normal experience or normal bandwidth experience in those first months?
I was a bit one layer out from the center of this. I didn't get added.
You would always send Fauci. You go first.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
He was right in the middle. I didn't get added to the COVID response team until about May. And at that point, it was really Mike Pence who was running that team and who was very thoughtful and a very good manager and listened to everybody's perspective and never tried to drive things in a political direction. But there's a lot of other things going on there, of course, and some of the information that was coming from those White House briefings from the president were quite alarming in terms of their disconnect with what we knew scientifically. And Tony Fauci was the one who often had to be the person to say, well, no, actually, we don't think that's correct. But all the while, what I was doing in 2020, though, Jeffrey, was basically trying to marshal every kind of scientific effort we could find in academia, in government, in the private sector. We built partnerships in days that would normally take years to put together. And the fact that this vaccine, the mRNA vaccines, got developed and tested in a rigorous phase 3 trial of over 30,000 people and found to be safe and effective in 11 months, I think will be seen by historians as the greatest achievement of science up to that point.
Of science. One of the oddities of that fact is that could count legitimately as an achievement of Donald Trump and the Trump administration.
Absolutely.
They've run from that great scientific achievement. I'm sure this is a question that preoccupies you. Why would you run from that? But I want to step back just one step before we talk about what's going on right now at NIH. Frame out, as in your last couple of years, talk about NIH and its role in society and its role in medicine, the size of its budget, the effect it had, the effect that NIH science had on cancer and heart disease, just to name two. I guess what I'm asking is, what did you and your team hand off over the last couple of years?
It's been an amazing success story, and it's the envy of the rest of the world. America has been the unquestioned leader in biomedical research for decades.
NIH is the largest biomedical
largest supporter in the world. Budget until recently of about $48 billion each year, which has been steadily discussed and often added to by a bipartisan Congress who sees this as an investment worth making. And believe me, this is not a circumstance where it's easy for people to get access to those dollars. Most of that money is awarded to grantees who write a very bold, ambitious proposal that gets reviewed in the most rigorous peer review system the world has ever seen. And the ones that are in the top 20% get funded, and the rest, sorry. So we're leaving a lot of great science on the table, even with this $48 billion. The opportunities there are even greater than the supply of resources. But it is phenomenal when you look and see what has happened. And you can pick any field. Let's take cancer. Cancer deaths have actually been dropping for about the last 25 years. They're now 30% lower than they were at the turn of the century. If you look at conditions like cancer that's spread to other parts of the body, so-called stage 4, that used to be the end of the story. We are now curing more and more people with stage 4 cancer, especially with immunotherapy, which is still building on its success to get further and further in that space. Heart disease, deaths from heart disease are down now about 75% of what they were 40 years ago, and that's NIH. And deaths from stroke, likewise. And then we have cures of things like cystic fibrosis or like sickle cell disease, which is now curable by a gene therapy approach approved by the FDA, and a phenomenal story of bringing all that technology together. This would not have happened without NIH driving that enterprise. And of course, let's not forget HIV. Those of you who were around in 1989 or 1991, remember that was a death sentence. After your diagnosis, you might have a year, you might have less. Now, if you have access to antiretrovirals developed by NIH in collaboration with companies, your lifespan is essentially normal. And people forget all that.
Not to make too much of this, but that was an Anthony Fauci-led
Absolutely.
effort. How many lives do you attribute to Anthony Fauci? How many saved lives can you attribute to? No, seriously.
Yeah, it's certainly in the tens of millions. Tony Fauci was a big architect of PEPFAR, the George W. Bush effort to get antiretrovirals to people in Africa. Last I heard, that saved 26 million lives, that program alone. But I have to also say that program has now been terminated.
Right, and we're going to get to that in a second. It wasn't that long ago that politicians of both parties were almost competing to see who could add to the NIH budget. Was it COVID that actually turned everything on its head? And I'm asking you this knowing that you've been self-critical and critical of the public health complex to some degree. How much of that problem do you attribute to the mistakes made by public health officials in the 2020-2021 period?
I think it was a combination of judgment errors, which are easier to see in retrospect than when you're in the middle of an emergency, which we were. I'll put some of those on me when I'm given the chance, as I often was, to talk to the public about what do we know and what you should do today about avoiding death from COVID. I wish every time I had said, We are still learning about this virus. There's a whole lot we don't understand. I'm going to tell you the best information that the experts have got, but it might be wrong, and we might have to change it in a couple of weeks when we get more data. But we didn't say that. We basically said, here's what you got to do. Well, because there was a sense of trying to motivate people to save their lives, and if it was the best we've got, then that's what they should do. But if it changed a month later, people began to wonder, do these guys know what they're talking about? And we began to lose trust as a consequence of that, especially as politics got into this. And again, to rail on social media, as social media began passing all kinds of information to people that might have sounded credible, but was in complete discord with the actual facts, and brought a lot of people into crazy approaches that were not going to help them. And Jeffrey, the saddest story of all this, and it is unbelievably sad, is when you add up how many people lost their lives because of misinformation, just from basically deciding that the vaccine was not going to be for them. The Kaiser Family Foundation estimates between June of 21 and March of 22, 234,000 Americans died unnecessarily in graveyards today, like 3 jumbo jets crashing every day for 9 months unnecessarily. That is the most unbelievably heartbreaking story. And that happened in the United States of America because politics and science got all tangled up. And when you mix politics and science, you just get politics.
Let's stipulate that there is an ongoing attack now on the NIH. I think even those of us who have thought about the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, are surprised at the alacrity and the depth of this attack. From your perspective, what are the consequences of the attack on the NIH, its individual offices, and its budget?
It's totally devastating, and is far beyond anything I would have thought possible. I've lived through administration transitions, and there's always some bumpy spaces there, like hiring freezes. But this was totally different than anything that has ever happened. Immediately after inauguration, people who are working at the NIH in the so-called intramural program were unable to start any new projects. That was prohibited.
Intramural program meaning?
Inside the government
Inside
facility.
the complex.
Yeah, which is only about 10% of NIH. Most of it's out there in those universities across the country. But I had a lab in the intramural part, so I could see what was happening. You couldn't start any new projects. You couldn't order supplies. You were not allowed to go to a meeting, a scientific meeting, or speak to anybody publicly. It was like just all shut down. That has only gotten marginally better in the course of the last 3 months. But more significantly, in terms of the budgetary part, basically the way in which grants get awarded, that requires that peer review that I mentioned. That requires those meetings to happen. Those were stopped. The second level that reviews the grants that seem to have done well to be sure they're in the right kind of portfolio balance, those got stopped. And so months went by where normally NIH would have awarded about $3 billion worth of new research sitting there in a file. On top of that, there's now been an effort to actually defund existing grants. People who are already partway through a project being told, I'm sorry, stop work now, including people running clinical trials for things like Alzheimer's disease or postpartum depression, where people were enrolled in these trials trusting that this was going to be something that was going to add to knowledge, and then are dropped in the middle saying, I'm sorry, we're stopping now, with no knowledge being generated. That is so hard to justify. You might even say that's unethical. And yet those things happen because of the very ham-handed, careless, heartless approach of stopping research, firing people, and cutting budgets.
What do you understand the motivation to be?
I wish I really knew that, because it makes so little sense. Let me be clear. NIH, like any government agency, is always appropriate to look at and scrutinize and say, okay, are there some economies that could be made here? I did a lot of that during my 12 years as director. But if you do that, you try to figure out what's the specific area that would benefit from that kind of rebooting. You don't do a across-the-board, let's fire 1,165 people because they've only been here less than a year. That was a thing that happened back in February, Valentine's Day, in fact. And you don't also decide, if you're going to fire more people, that you basically clean out all the administrative support systems so that now you can't order anything or write a new contract or hire anybody because there's nobody who knows anything about HR. It just cuts you off at the knees. So this is being done in a way that is pretty much dismissive of consequences, almost like that doesn't matter. What matters is to show we have cut the budget and we have cut the head count, and that means we win. For the medical research, maybe this is okay for a Silicon Valley thing where, move fast and break things. That's what's happening. But this ought to be first, do no harm. This is our lives we're talking about, and a lot of harm is being done.
What are the long-term consequences of the things that have already happened? I don't want you to speculate about what's coming down the road. What are the long-term consequences to medical education, to research, to fighting specific diseases that you've talked about?
What I worry about most is the long-term consequence of losing a generation of young scientists. I'm talking a lot to people who are currently in PhD programs or MD programs wanting to go into research. Fully a third of the people I talk to are actively exploring the possibility of leaving the United States, going to Europe. Germany is making quite a nice offer. So is France, so is the UK. Australia thinks this is their moment to bring on a whole lot of talent. This is the brain drain reversing its direction. We have depended so heavily on being the place that everybody wanted to come to do research, and they've many times stayed here and become part of our Nobel Prize winning amazing leadership, and now we're driving those people away. And if we don't have that, that's our most important resource, what's going to happen?
I have to ask you this final question. I'm asking you to speculate, but we don't understand the motivations. People did not come to you and others, senior NIH officials, and said, the reason we're doing these cuts and that cut is the following.
Right.
What is your best guess about why this dismantling is taking place? Is it a resentment reaction against COVID policies? Is it something deeper than that? Is it, we talked about this in the last panel, is it a mistrust of expertise and knowledge itself? What do you, when you're up late at night, which I assume you are thinking about this and worrying about it, what's the thing that comes to your mind?
I think it's all of those things. I think a lot of it is just across the board attitude that any federal employee is lazy, bureaucratic, and easily dispensed, and there won't be a consequence. And that, in the minds of some of the folks that are making these decisions, that seems to apply regardless of what agency we're talking about. They're just all needing to be, as I think in the words of the head of OMB, we need to traumatize the federal employee category so that they will figure out it's time to leave. I mean, there's pretty mean-spirited stuff going on there. Is there a specific targeting of NIH? I don't know. I do think that perhaps the first Trump administration was not totally happy with NIH, with Tony, and sometimes with me disagreeing with the perspective that was put forward in that very complicated year of COVID. But, before we stop, I do want to say I still have some hope here about NIH now that we finally have an actual director. Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford has arrived. Admittedly, he and I have had some disagreements about
That's an understatement.
But he understands what medical research is about. He understands the consequences of making these drastic changes or cutting the budget by 40%, which is what a leaked OMB passback said might happen next year. And I believe we got to give him a chance to succeed, and I hope he does.
Well, like me, I'm sure you could listen to Dr. Collins all day. We do have to go, but he has written a book. I will note that. I want to thank you for sharing some of your views with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you
for coming.